Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Insomnia Fix. Teaser, I am changing the name of this podcast, and you will find out what that is next week for the 100th episode. So, this is the last episode that is called the Insomnia Fix. How exciting! In honor of the name change and rebranding that I'm doing, I am offering something super fun and I hope very valuable for you. So, I am offering a free sleep breakthrough session. And so, in this session, this is actually going to be aired on this podcast, but I'm going to give you my top 3 tips for you personally to start sleeping better. So, when you sign up for the call, I'll send you an assessment to fill out that's going to look at diet and blood sugar and hormone balance and liver function and gut health and brain inflammation and sleep hygiene and mental stress. And I'm going to use that assessment to figure out the top 3 things that I recommend that you start working on so that you can start sleeping better soon. And so we'll meet on video on Zoom if you're comfortable with video to go over these top 3 things that I recommend for you. So you can sign up for the sleep breakthrough session. The link is in the show notes, and I would love to talk to you about this. I'm really excited about it. So I think it'll be really cool to see how different people have different things that they need to work on and see who you might resonate with and by listening to other people's assessments and what's going to work best for you. So if you've been struggling, you've tried all different things, then I highly recommend taking advantage of this offer while it's here. All right. Today I want to talk about how to figure out the right diet and how to make sense of nutrition because it's so confusing, right? Like there's so much contradictory advice out there. Should you eat plant-based or animal-based? Should you eat high fat or keto or low fat or low carb or whatever it is? And I remember that even when I graduated from nutrition school, so I got a master's in holistic nutrition in 2008, I was still confused about what I should recommend for people. The school I went to really focused on a vegetarian diet, and I was vegetarian at the time, so that made sense to me. But I also didn't think that everyone should be vegetarian. I didn't know why. I just had this instinct that that wasn't right for everyone. And at the time, I was dating a guy who was super tall and super skinny and ate a lot of meat. And I didn't necessarily think that he should be vegetarian. And so, and I know that this is very controversial. And I've even had one, at least one, if not more, bad reviews written on this podcast because of my stance about this and saying this. But anyway, when I graduated, I was confused and I had started working on an organic and biodynamic farm at this time. I'd actually volunteered there for years and then I became an employee. So I managed the volunteers during the summer. So this was from May through October. And I did this for 4 summers. And the owners of the farm, who are now my dear friends, um, Dale, the wife of the owner of the farm, she gave me a journal called I think it's called Wise Traditions, and it's put out by the Weston A Price Foundation. And it's a lot about nutrition. And I started reading it and I was like, this actually makes sense. So that's what I want to talk to you about today is I want to explain about Weston A. Price, who he was, what he found, and how I have made sense of this very simple approach to figuring out what we should be eating. And so we can ignore all the nutrition stuff that we're hearing all the time of you should eat more vitamin C or vitamin D or whatever. Like that's what I learned in school is what vitamins and minerals do. But to me, this concept that I'm going to explain just put it all together. And I will say, I mentioned that I was vegetarian at the time when I started working on this farm. and learning about Weston A Price and also seeing this farm, it really changed my mind about being vegetarian. Because the reason I became a vegetarian was I started reading about how horribly the animals were being treated and how bad that was for us to eat those animals, right? That aren't thriving. They're totally sick. They're given antibiotics and drugs because they're sick. They aren't eating what they're meant to be eating. That's why they're sick. They're given hormones for a lot of different animals, and they're just in these horrible, filthy conditions. But on the farm I was working on, things were very different. So, yes, this is a farm that's growing organic produce, mainly vegetables and some berries, because that's about all we can grow here. And Idaho is actually where the farm is, right over the border from Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And but this farm also has cows, and so they sell beef, they sell raw milk, they have chickens, so they sell their eggs, and they have pigs, so they sell pork. But what I saw, and this farm is beyond organic, so it's called actually biodynamic. And there's a lot to that, but what I want to explain here is that this means that the farm is kind of a closed circuit and that they aren't adding all these inputs from other places. So what that means is that the animals are providing a lot of the fertility for the farm and they're a necessary part of the farm. So for example, the cow's poop is turned into compost and biodynamic really focuses on the health of the soil. So conventional farms might add fertilizer, which is NPK, nitrogen, hydrogen, potassium, I think it is. Whereas a biodynamic farm is is producing this natural mineral rich soil of all minerals, not just these three that have been isolated in conventional fertilizer. And so then when vegetables are grown in that soil, it's making them so much more nutrient rich. And I saw how the chickens, as they pecked in the ground and ate the insects, they aerated the soil. And so they always rotate where the chickens are living every year. And so then, that land that they've been on the year before is more nutrient rich from their poop and from that soil being aerated to grow plants the next year. And the pigs do the same thing as they're rooting in the dirt. They are breaking up the soil. They're sending oxygen and nutrients into that soil. So I just saw how the animals were part of the circle of life and they're very well treated. They're living in the conditions that they're meant to live in. They're cared for, they're fed the food that they are meant to eat. The cows are grass fed. The chickens are fed organic, soy-free feed in addition to the natural bugs that they're getting. And then, the pigs are eating a lot of the scraps that come from the farm. So it was this very closed circuit. So that totally changed my views. And so I can see how eating meat from this farm is very different than eating meat that you're buying in the grocery store that's from these factory farms where the animals are not treated well and they're very sick and they're given all these different drugs that then we ingest when we eat them. Okay, so now let's talk about Weston A. Price. Who is this? So he was actually a dentist and he was practicing in the 1930s, and he found that so many more of his patients were getting more cavities. And 10 years ago, this wasn't happening. Guess what also happened around the 1930s? This is when our food industry was born, and processed foods, especially refined flour, refined sugar, and canned goods, were in mass supply. So until this point, people were eating what they could eat locally. But these processed foods, which are nothing like what is available today, using these refined foods, but just refined sugar, flour, canned goods, as the majority of people, especially in cities, started using these food or started eating these foods, they started getting more cavities. So Dr. Price decided to travel the world and look at different cultures and what they were eating. He even sent samples of what they were eating back to the labs in the US to get analyzed for their nutritional content. And so he traveled to all these different places. And he found that, of course, every culture was eating something completely different. So, for example, in Switzerland, they ate a lot of dairy, raw butter, milk, and cream. They ate a lot of rye bread. They would eat meat about once a week, but they used all the parts of the animal. Where in Scotland, they ate a lot of oats and root vegetables. They ate some dairy too. They had some fish and meat and berries in the summer. And but those are completely different from, say, the Maasai tribe in Africa that's known for eating blood. They do. They eat a lot of meat and fat and blood and milk and also honey and tree bark. And that diet's very different than what people in Tahiti are eating, right? They're eating a ton of seafood and coconut and root vegetables and fruit. And so what he did is he traveled to all these places and he studied their diets. And he found that when cultures were eating their traditional diet, they didn't get many cavities. They had these great bone structures. So the 1930s was also when the camera was available. So he took pictures of a lot of these people. And so they would have these big white teeth and huge jaws and strong bones, and they just look very healthy. And he also found that when people were eating the traditional diet, that they didn't get sick as often, especially tuberculosis was one of the main diseases of the day. And so he found out that when people were eating this traditional diet, they were less likely to get sick with tuberculosis. And he found that as soon as within the first generation of people starting to eat these processed foods, that their health deteriorated. So they were more likely to get tuberculosis. They got way more cavities, and the jaw structure of the children of people eating these foods completely changed. They would have this narrow face structure and palate and crooked teeth, and again, a lot of cavities. And so he has all these pictures, photos documenting that. And so what he found was that even though different cultures were eating very different foods, they still had a lot of the same, they had some same similarities in that they were always eating whole foods, right? So this wasn't even a thing then. Everything was organic because pesticides were not used. That didn't even need to be a term. That's just how it was. But of course, they were eating whole, um, unprocessed foods because that's all that was available. Now, every single culture he found ate animal products and they prized animal foods. Even if some cultures didn't eat meat often, the animal foods were the most prized foods, and they ate the entire animal. So from nose to tail, as it's called, right? So they really focused on organ meats. They also focused on bones, especially making broth from bones. So it wasn't just eating muscle meat like we do today. And now we know this makes sense because there are different amino acids in muscle meat versus the kind of sinews and tendons versus the fat and things like that. So it's really important to be eating the whole animal to get that full spectrum and the right balance of amino acids. Now, remember I mentioned he sent samples back to the lab in the US, so he found that all of these different cultures, even though they're eating completely different things, that they had 10 times or more the fat soluble vitamins than what Americans were eating if they were eating the standard American diet at that time, which included all these processed foods. So the fat soluble vitamins are vitamins A, D, E, and K. So pretty much all the foods these people were eating were very nutrient rich, which makes sense, right? Like the processed foods have zero nutrients. Refined sugar, refined flour, canned goods have almost no nutrients. Whereas if you're eating whole foods, they are just nutrient rich. That's just how they're made because that's what we're meant to be eating. What's interesting too is he found that some people or that every all of these cultures ate some animal foods raw and that they cooked most of their vegetables. He also found that every culture ate fermented foods or drank fermented beverages. So things like sauerkraut and kimchi and beet kvass that we can think of relating to different cultures, every culture had something like that. That's a really important part of the diet. They also knew how to properly prepare seeds, grains, and nuts. So, seeds, grains, and nuts they have a lot of anti-nutrients in them. And when you ferment or soak or sprout them, those nutrients are released, the starches are broken down so it's more easily digestible. And so then that actually makes the foods good for us. And so we've gotten away from this, now that we're in the now that we're in the 2020s, over 100 years later, that we don't prepare foods this way. Our bread is made really quickly in factories instead of traditional sourdough bread, for example. And so anyway, cultures instinctively knew how to properly prepare these grains and nuts and seeds. They also found that people ate a lot of fat, although it varied. It could be between 30 and 80% of calories was in fat, but only 4% of that came from polyunsaturated fats. So that's like what the vegetable oils that we've been told are healthy in quotes for us are high in, but these traditional cultures were getting hardly any polyunsaturated fats. They also had equal omega-3 to 6 fatty acids. They ate some kind of salt, which is makes sense now because we know it's rich in minerals. And one interesting thing too, they really focused on fertility. And so men and women of childbearing age were given the most nutrient-rich foods, especially those organ meats or like fish roe, for example, in Tahiti. And so they really focused on people who are having children being the most getting the most nutritious food so that they could have healthy children. So again, all these cultures are eating completely different things, but there are these similarities in them. And so to me, this makes the most sense is that we just need to eat how we were eating, let's say 150, 200 years ago. And we don't necessarily need to go back to eating paleo, right? Tens of thousands of years ago. We have evolved since the hunter gatherer time. Not that I think that paleo is necessarily bad, but I don't think it also has to be that extreme because as Dr. Price found, there were plenty of cultures eating grains. They just knew how to properly prepare them. And same with beans, right? And same with dairy. Like that's not allowed in paleo, but there were uh, societies that thrived on dairy, and that was a main source of their food and calories. And so to me, just thinking of how our grandmothers, maybe our great grandmothers at this point, were eating before the 1930s, before these processed foods were widespread, that's how we should be eating. And so it's as simple as eating whole foods and focusing on that. And so it can help to think about your ancestry and maybe what your ancestors would have been eating. But I'll also say no one was eating a keto diet. Maybe that's not true. Maybe the Inuits in Alaska were, um, where they were eating a lot of fat, but it really varied, you know, even the macronutrient balance or fat, protein, and carbohydrate balance of what people were eating then. So I think it's a matter of really focusing on whole foods and all these superfoods and things that are marketed. That's not what traditional people were focusing on. They were focusing on fermented foods, properly prepared foods, animal products, um, and, including eating the entire animal. So to me, that just made so much sense. Once I learned about this, I was like, "Oh, this is how we should be eating." And so that based on seeing how different it was, seeing how the animals were treated on this farm has completely changed my view and my diet. And so now I do eat plenty of animal foods. And So that this is like this simple, and I am all about keeping it simple. So I'm never am asking my clients to count grams of anything or to especially to count calories or anything like that. It's more focusing on nutrient dense diet. So I will put a link in the show notes where you can find out more about Weston A. Price. There's a foundation named after him called the Weston A. Price Foundation. So there's a lot of information on their website. I used to be a chapter leader for them. I believe in a lot of what they say about diet. I don't believe in everything that they believe in. So they have some strong stances about other things so I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with everything that this foundation says, but I think everything that Weston A. Price found about diet really makes sense to me. So I will link the website there in the show notes. I also have a previous episode, episode 14, I did about eating well as well, like how to eat for sleep. And so I will link to that as well. I talk about different things there about blood sugar and macronutrient balance and things like that. But if you want to know more about diet, then that is a good episode to listen to as well. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you sign up for that sleep breakthrough call. I would love to help you and give you some tips so that you can start sleeping better. And as always, reach out if you have any questions, and I will talk to you next week.